and assure the Israelis that their security interests, that the security of Israel remains a top priority of the United States, and we take every step in order to ensure that, including working on a deal to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon.
Down to business on the Iranian nuclear talks and much more. Let's welcome to MidPoint, founder and president of the Center for Security Policy and former Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Policy. Pleasure to have Frank Gaffney back in the house. Frank, thanks so much for being here.
Ed, thank you for having me.
Frank, this is amazing in some cases when you read about it. The world's nuclear inspectors reported on Thursday Iran's still refusing to answer their long-standing questions about suspected work on nuclear weapons and design. I got to tell you something. You ask, you don't get an answer. You ask, you get stonewalled. How much more can this game go on? Because I'll tell you what, you got to be getting tired of it at this point because you know that they're hiding everything from the inspectors.
Absolutely. What this is really saying to us is if this is how they behave before there's a deal, imagine what kind of obstructionism and subterfuges and game playing we're going to see after one has been struck. And the fact that the President of the United States seems untroubled by this behavior, to say nothing of the rest of what Iran is up to, including, as you alluded to in the opening, endless threats to the United States, as well as to its friends and allies in the region. This augurs very ill because, at a minimum, what it is saying to the Iranians is, and again, you've indicated this already, they think we're going to settle for any deal they'll give us. And as a result, they are emboldened to press the hardest terms that they can, and practically speaking, to ensure that there is no impediment to them having a nuclear weapon, which they've long sought and they're at the cusp of acquiring, I believe.
All right, Frank, this comes from the New York Times. The president cites that finding in recent interviews to assert that the Iranian program is now far more constrained, an argument for playing out the negotiations to conclusion, basically saying, look, it's not that big a deal. We know something that you, Frank, you, Ed, and everybody else doesn't know, that we can let this ride and everything will be just fine. How you doing, Frank? You falling for it so far?
It's not terribly appealing to me, I must say, and I can't believe that it's really selling with the American people more generally. I'm quite certain that the Israelis aren't going to buy it, because what is coming down the pike, if I can use this expression, is a pig in a poke. We're being told that we've frozen the program. We've been told that we've rolled it back. We've been told that there are all kinds of inspection measures. We've been told that they're going to make further concessions that will ensure greater transparency. We've been seeing we'll have a greater situational awareness as to whether they're breaking out for that nuclear capability that they obviously still aspire to. None of this is true. None of it's true.
But if it's not true, and again, here it is, 12 years we've been going back and forth here with Iran right now. 12 years. And then you have Ashton Carter, who comes out and says that basically Iran and the Islamic State are the biggest threat. Well, finally, somebody from the administration actually came out and said something in public that people have been saying for a long time. But knowing this, then, what's the smoking gun here, Frank? What is it that the American public can see or Congress can push? Something that gives us an inkling that we know they're lying and we know the president needs to push harder.
Well, look, I think what Ash Carter said is true, of course. He was immediately repudiated for it, by the way, and that's not a good sign that the Secretary of Defense is going to be slapped around by the White House. It's been happening under the previous Secretaries of Defense. Not a surprise necessarily, but not a good sign at a moment like this. And look, the problem with the smoking gun is that it may be a smoking crater as a result of a nuclear weapon used by the Iranians. I think most people who know this regime and understand its inner workings, and particularly this, well, theological conviction that its mission in this generation, not in some future generation, in this generation of leaders, is to bring about the return of what they call the 12th Imam, the Mahdi, the Messiah, according to their faith. And the fact that in their faith tradition, you basically have to have a kind of apocalyptic circumstance to engineer that return of the Mahdi, makes this a very fraught deal. And you know, we may not have a whole lot more indication that things have gone terribly bad if we persist in allowing them to build up this capability.
End of the day, this is a government that wants to kill as often as they can the people who don't believe in how they believe. Hang on for just a second, Frank. More signs that the U.S. and other nations missed so badly were the ones emanating from Russia and Ukraine. That next on MidPoint.
So your question to me is, has the ceasefire been broken? My question back to you would be, did the ceasefire ever begin? Did we ever have a ceasefire? I don't think that there was ever a cease in the hostilities.
Great question and great answer there. Welcome back to MidPoint. The former Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Policy, founder and president of the Center for Security Policy, Frank Gaffney. What do you say, Frank? I think that's a great question and a great answer. This ceasefire in the Ukraine, there was never a ceasefire.
Not only wasn't there ever a ceasefire, there wasn't any prospect of a ceasefire. This is, one of those fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me kind of deals. The European leaders, Angela Merkel and François Hollande in France, had every reason to believe that what Putin was going to do at this latest round of negotiations, and certainly their Ukrainian counterpart did, was buy time, create this illusion that somehow Russia is cooperating, Russia is being a partner in seeking, a peaceful solution to this horror, when Russia is the perpetrator.
Frank, they had to know, seriously, but let me stop you there. They had to know, look, these are intelligent people you're talking about, presidents of major nations. They had to know that this guy was hosing them from the start, and it was a lie. So knowing that they're cutting a deal with a liar, then what does that say about them as negotiators and seriously wanting to cut a deal to knock this guy down?
What it says about them as negotiators is they
stink.
Fundamentally
they're awful.
they fundamentally are dealing from a position of extraordinary weakness, which is amazing given the power of their economies and so on, and the threat of sanctions. Fundamentally, they're looking at a Russia that they don't want to cross, most especially Angela Merkel. They have requirements for imported energy to varying degrees, as the Europeans more generally do, from Russia. And Russia has played that card in the past, an economic warfare weapon. And I think what they're looking at is they don't want this natty little problem of Ukraine to interfere with their relationship with the Russians, trade relations and so on. And as a result, I think they kind of took a dive. And unfortunately, it's not the only time this has happened. The history of modern European negotiations and wars, for that matter, is littered with countries that decided, oh, we'll just sacrifice some little country that's in our way, notably Czechoslovakia before World War II.
Frank, there's the point I want to make here. But in your opinion, is it not fair to say that if Angela Merkel and François Hollande, if they were told today, everything will be fine, give up Ukraine, let them move in, let the Russians take over, they would put their hands up and surrender without even saying a word?
I think they probably would not want it to be so bold, but this is the practical effect of what they're doing. It's a salami slice strategy, but it's the same practical endpoint.
I want to read you something, too, and this comes from today's edition of The Independent, where it talks about the House of Lords in the United Kingdom criticizing the EU and Britain for, quote-unquote, sleepwalking into crisis as Moscow and NATO remain on a diplomatic collision course. One, it just goes to prove that people who may criticize America, we certainly weren't the first ones who didn't see this coming. There was plenty of warning. And two, do you think it's a diplomatic collision course, or are we looking at something more serious?
What Vladimir Putin is signaling in a lot of different ways is he's prepared to use violent force against others as well. There's posturing with his nuclear weapons capabilities, not just his conventional forces. This is very alarming because the Russians actually have a doctrine that says the use of nuclear weapons is really just like any other weapon, and they can be used to control escalation. We've had reason to believe they've moved nuclear weapons forces into Crimea, and I think there's a distinct possibility this thing could rocket out of control unless the United States and its allies make absolutely clear to Vladimir Putin this is not a winning wicket for him.
Are we looking at, and again, I'm not trying to go overboard here, but with about a minute left, can we say that there might be the accidental nuclear release, a small weapon that is used here something that would be along the lines of an accident, but could be more than just the bombing of a building?
Yeah, I don't think this is going to be an accident. I think it will be by design and intentionally done by Vladimir Putin. I'm just saying that I think that's not something we can discount, especially given what has happened to the Russian buildup of its nuclear capabilities and the decline under President Obama, most especially of our deterrent to them.
Welcome back to the Cold War, right? Just when you thought it was all over and we could open up a brand new generation here, we are right back into the 50s and the 60s all
hotter
over
and
again.
hotter.
Indeed. Frank, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll look forward to seeing you again.
Good. Thank you.
Take care. More Americans than ever are unhappy with organized religion. Now, you may say, wait a minute, where are you getting this from? But actually, the statistics right now and a lot of the surveys are bearing it out. Organized religion is taking a lot of heat these days. So now the churches have to face themselves with a very specific issue. How do you bring the faithful, and maybe those who have gone astray, back into the pews? Would you believe it comes down to something that might resemble video games? Stay tuned. We question everything. MidPoint continues.